Welcome, everybody, to our second annual JP Morgan event on longevity and the future of medicine. As you know, the science is developing really rapidly, and it's a really exciting time to be in this field. So the plan for tonight is we'll just have a short panel discussion of about 45 minutes or so. Then we can all continue the conversation over a cocktail reception afterward. So I'll just introduce our speaker, our moderator first. We're really lucky this year to have Sonia Arison. She's an author of a best-selling author of 100 Plus, How the Coming Age of Longevity Will Change Everything. And if you haven't read it yet, you should.
Yes, oh, here. This is working, okay, good. Yes, well, welcome, thank you for being here. I know that some of you know some of us, but maybe not all of you know all of us. So I thought I would start the panel off by asking each panelist to sort of say who you are, what your company does, or what your research is, briefly. And like why you care about longevity. So let's start with Simon.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Simon Melo. I'm an investigator at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, which is just about an hour's north of here. And I'm also the newly minted CEO of a brand new startup funded by YC called Gerostate Alpha. So you said keep it short, so that's short.
Wait, why do you care about longevity?
Why do I care about longevity? Okay. So ever since I was a little kid, I have actually been interested in the biology of aging and trying to understand why it happens and what we can do to attenuate it. Currently, the best methods for slowing aging are stuff which is familiar to everyone in this audience. You all know. Eat right, exercise regularly, and sleep a lot. It's not a very satisfying message in this day and age. So that's why I started Gerostate Alpha.
All right, I like that.
I'm Kristin. I'm the founder and CEO of BioAge. And like Simon, I've cared about aging for most of my life, really because I've always been driven by making people healthy. And it just seemed like you can get a lot more bang for your buck by working on aging than working on some individual age-related diseases one at a time. So I come from more a computational background. I did a PhD at the University of Toronto and a postdoc at Stanford, where I applied AI and systems biology to map out pathways that influence human aging. And out of my postdoc, I founded BioAge just a little over 3 years ago now. So it's been a really exciting progression. We're about 20 people now. We just filed IP protecting our first drug for aging. So it's been a great journey.
Okay, Eden?
Aiden Sankut, founder and managing partner of Felicis Ventures. We're very happy to be investor in BioAge. And other than reading 100 Plus, my interest in aging is from an investor. First of all, from a personal perspective, I'm obviously super interested in it. But from an investor perspective, it's probably the largest area where in terms of like GDP spend, in terms of people and being meaningful to their lives. So I can't think of a more important area. Well, interestingly enough, now that we have this amazing event and it's in the second year, but like 5-10 years ago, there was probably hardly I don't even know if we could fill a single table in this room. And now we have investors, we have companies, we have incubators, we have funds that are dedicated to longevity, let alone these amazing scientists and companies and founders that are amazing things. And I'm just really, really proud to be part of that journey.
Hi, I'm Laura. I run Longevity VC, so we're a venture fund focused on longevity companies as well as Age One, an early-stage accelerator. And I think that the answer to the question why be fascinated by this space is probably if evolution gave you modular switches to control aging, why would you not want to flip them?
I like that too. These are all great answers. Iden, let's sort of start with, here's a question directed at you. Longevity sort of has been an atypical place, and maybe Laura can answer this too, for VCs. So obviously you're interested in it, but why now? Why is Felicis suddenly getting interested in the longevity space?
Well, I think one of the things we do as a venture firm, we're a little bit unique in the sense that we like to invest in the traditional areas of consumer enterprise, but also frontier technologies. And with frontier, I think health is the one place where we can see technology have amazing impact. And the physical health and all the obvious stuff, there's already been a lot of progression, but I think longevity has been misunderstood for a really long time as kind of more of a vanity area. But the way that I was thinking about it in very simple terms, we already have humans that have lived to be 119, 122 years old. So a lot of people think, oh, this is like science fiction. We're going to take people that are 80 and make them live to be at 200. However, even if you look at the real truth today, we do have somebody that lived to be 120, but it's 1 in a million, maybe 1 in 100 million. What if all of these approaches have worked in 10 years and that number went from 1 in a million to 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 10,000? That would have a hugely positive impact in society, because right now we are trying to take all of our productive resources and basically spend it on people in their last 6 months or last year of their life, trying to like fix them or extend their life when they're most broken. What if this was like, some kind of a vaccination when people were kind of, had a chance to age a lot slower or be in much better shape in 70s as they were in age 7? How can you not be excited about it? I'm excited about it as a parent. I'm excited about it as a son. As an investor, I can't think of a more important part of society where that can have impact. And I think this is also a great area where not only is it a great mission, but you can create a great commercial company like Google, Amazon, all these companies hit or get close to $1 trillion. In my mind, like the next Google, next Facebook could be in this space. So I'm a strong believer of that.
Laura, do you have something to add to that? I see you nodding your head.
Oh, I'm just agreeing completely, and I think the only thing I'd add is, I started longevity not to start a venture fund and make a maximal profit, but rather to kind of, help aging advance. And the way to do that at the time in 2011 was to start a venture fund, because there was no funding for the space. And the way we thought about it was, if you went back to like 1973, what would you do to help make oncology maximally kind of move faster? And it would really be start Genentech. And so I think that's kind of the same, when Cynthia came out with the first mutations for aging, like the 1990s, I think that there was never a Genentech moment. So we're kind of like, well, we'll try and catalyze one now.
Okay. Well, so here we are with people who are on the front lines of aging research. And a burning question for me, that I would love an answer to this, is what's the lowest hanging fruit in this area? I mean, what do the scientists have probably, I'm curious to see what the science answers are versus the investors' answers, but, what are we going to get to first? Are you hearing me okay? Oh. Got it, thank you.
Yeah, I think the lowest hanging fruit is those things that already work in model animals, where we've seen them work over and over again, because there's a long list of those things. I mean, starting really with rapamycin, where they first published that result in 2009, and that's, Restore Bio did their phase 2b clinical trial successfully just a few months ago. So that's really gone all the way from basic academic discovery through to translation. And there's a long list of those things now that have been shown over and over again to make mice live longer. And those are ready for translation now.
Okay, anyone else? Low-hanging fruit?
I mean, I think one thing to add, and again, the science perspective is much more important, but we also, like, whenever we look at a company, the question we ask is why now? And one of the amazing things, I think, like what Laura is mentioning, but also like the fact that Kristin can start BioAge today, I don't know if she could start BioAge 20 years ago, maybe not even 10 years ago. So number one, like you didn't have a lot of data. Even if you had the data, you couldn't really analyze that. Maybe there were 5 companies in the world that could even put that data into a warehouse. Today, like a company like BioAge with very few people can come in and like actually find this data in various different biobanks and actually like apply AI and machine learning to it. So I think in some ways like it's the golden age, like whenever we had like new energy source like oil, it completely like transformed industrial economies. I feel with the current way like data is the new oil, now like it can truly impact areas like longevity, where instead of being like bordering science fiction, it could be a real science, really instrumented area. And that's I think one of the reasons why we're really excited that we do think this potential is real and it's not just a mere dream.
Yeah, just following up on that, your comment about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that's absolutely true. And I think actually, to some extent, we're in this transition zone which has been fueled by breakthroughs in technology which are broadly applicable to much of biology. Even 18 months ago, you couldn't be doing the type of single-cell experiments which people are doing routinely in the lab now. Not so routine still, but it's still being done at a high level. And so technology, like most areas of sort of biology, has fueled this impetus to create many small companies, all of which are trying to tackle various aspects of the same problem, which is aging. There's going to be a lot of failures, but the same was true of the dot-com era, and there's going to be probably many right answers. There's no clear, correct answer at this point.
And I want Laura to answer this question too, but I have a quick follow-on. Is biotech still moving? I remember seeing a chart where it was moving faster than Moore's law. Are advances still happening that quickly? Do you see them happening that quickly?
Yeah, and you only got to look at the explosion of journals to believe that that's true. It's either people are either making a lot of money off crappy science in journals, or there's actually legitimate work, and there's so much of it that the journals are just exploding. So it's extremely difficult to keep pace with the technology at this point in time. You have to be a voracious reader and keep pace with all of these breakthroughs, any one of which you could specialize in.
Wow, it's like good news, bad news, right? How do you keep up? But it's great. Okay, low-hanging fruit, Laura.
Actually, I just want to echo Simon's point, which is I think chatting with Eric was, from the Buck was a fascinating thing, and that he brought up the great point that people might ask, well, why couldn't you find longevity genes in the 1920s? Well, because you couldn't isolate genes in the 1920s. Like cloning wasn't a thing until the 70s, the 80s. And so you see, the first longevity experiments occur in the 1990s, about a decade or two after you get the technological ability to kind of, do what leads to the breakthrough. And I think that Simon's point is really important in that it answers the question, why now, by sort of saying, well, because the tooling is here and it never was before.
To add on to that, I think that while this technology and data science is driving all of biotech, I guess I feel like the effects are especially keen and especially felt in aging, because really uniquely, like in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, we were really good at characterizing aging in invertebrates and worms and yeast and flies and making those animals live longer. And really only in the late 2000s were we sort of starting to look at mammalian aging. The rapamycin result was one of the first ones where they actually made mice live longer, and reproducibly several times, right, to be fair. And I think that because aging is so complex, we really should be studying human aging in humans rather than in invertebrates. There's just a lot of things that are going to be particular to humans, and you need these new data modalities and these new sort of AI-driven methods to be able to do that. And then that's only now.
That was going to be my next question, actually. So what about the mammalian models? I mean, are we focusing too much on that? And is that really translatable? And I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
On mammalian models in general? Yeah, I mean, this is sort of true in biotech more broadly, right? For the most part, the mouse is the model organism that's used because you really, if you're developing a therapy, you have to test it out in a live animal to see what happens. But there's going to be limitations there because mice age very differently from us. Like mice in the lab, they all die of cancer, and we die of a much more complex spectrum of diseases. So there's going to be a lot of things that are relevant to mouse aging and are less relevant to human aging.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on that one. I think these systems have their place in different pipelines. So if you want to work on a very specific pathology of aging in humans, then you need a model system which can recapitulate that. That might be mice, maybe not. Maybe it's an organoid model. There are a whole variety of different tools. And when you're trying to dissect aging per se, it's very difficult to identify pathways and targets which are relevant to human aging biology in humans unless you have gigantic data sets, many of which are available now in a variety of different ways. But I want to put in an advertisement for the invertebrate organisms, because we're not over invertebrate organisms yet. In terms of screens, they're unparalleled. You can't do survival screens
I completely
in mice.
agree with you. There are experiments, you can't do like a genome-wide knockout experiment in human or even a mouse.
By no means are we in a clear period of, it's just mammalian systems and all guns blazing. There's different systems you use in different paradigms.
And I think one quick investment perspective, and I don't know if you guys will agree with this, but in most other markets, there is this kind of concept of zero sum. So if Google is the leading ad service provider, Facebook is the leading social network, there is not really that much oxygen left for the number 2 company. No matter how much those companies like to say it's like a market and there are 10 other people, they might be not meaningful. But to Simon and Kristin's point, what's interesting about longevity is so complex that it's not going to be, I think, one company that is going to win it all. And that is one of the exciting things. I think the reason why we're so excited to be part of this journey, there is BioAge, there are other approaches to taking different parts of the human body and see if we can all help in different ways, because the way that people age and our body starts decaying is not just one thing. And so I think that's the beauty of it, that it is like an ecosystem. And the other interesting thing is, not only is it really exciting to see so much interest in it, so many companies, incubators, and funds, all the governments in the world will start to care about it, because if you're reading Economist or New York Times, one of the biggest interesting trends is the rapid declining of fertility and birth rate. So we have a rapidly aging society, but they're not in good shape. There are not enough young people to work and make up enough income to be able to take care of these people. Not only that, but those aging people, because we're not catching up with aging technology, are essentially getting sick, and we're spending all our money to take care of the sick, rather than actually trying to make society more productive, or reinvent resources so we don't run out of resources and stuff like that. So it's kind of very interesting times from that.
So we've sort of talked about how things were and where things are, but what happens, if everything goes right, which is a huge if, what are we going to be talking about in 10 years or 20 years? How do you see the future? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, this is we never hear this question. Where are we going to be? The stock answer most scientists will give you, 5 years. Right? It's always 5 years.
Right.
But it just slides off into the future. But I think, speaking on a point which Kristin made earlier, we're already in this transition zone where we're not talking about 5 years. Restore Bio, as Kristin pointed out, 2 successful clinical trials under their belt. That target was identified in invertebrates, translated to mice, then translated to people. So that story is going to be repeated over and over again. I think that the more interesting question is how far are we going to go in a short period of time? There are going to be an expanding range of indications put forward by a variety of different entities, whether or not they're biotech or big pharma. And ultimately, people will start targeting aging itself, as opposed to some of these other sort of approaches, which to some extent are a little bit serendipitous. But I think the targeting of aging itself is going to result in dramatic breakthroughs. We're still in this sort of incremental, improving health span a little bit, improving this indication or that indication, but I think the dramatic breakthroughs are going to come suddenly, and they're going to come fast, and I don't think we're going to be ready for them in terms of a societal impact.
Well, that's why everyone needs to read my book, 100 Plus. That was a perfect little setup. Anybody else want to address the question of, what does it look like for success? And
Yeah, for in 10 years, Restore Bio isn't the only one, right? Because Unity also just started a phase 1 with their anti-senescence drug, and we think that metformin is also an anti-aging drug. So what if all 3 of those get approved and we start taking the combination? People could already be doing that in 10 years. That might already be very efficacious. And then, there'll be this fat pipeline of newer interventions coming along the way.
Yeah, I think one thing that Kristin and BioAge really noted early on was the need for biomarkers and being able to measure interventions. And so I think the kind of hilarious case 10 years from now is that everyone's going to live longer, and they're either unaware of it, kind of they're on a medication that's relevant to longevity and they don't know it, or kind of B, we're just all kind of still curious, we still haven't solved the problem of kind of how the biomarkers work. And so I think that's almost kind of the fascinating question is, will it be the case that we've not solved the problem but made advances, and then we're all just kind of sitting around either unaware or unable to measure that?
And maybe one other interesting perspective to add. So we're always talking about the human body in terms of a constant. But one of the things we forget sometimes is that one of the factors that really affects aging is our mental health. So it's also interesting that in this age of abundance, we don't have to worry about food anymore. We don't have to worry about home anymore. There's a lot of great technologies, but we also have the highest rates of depression. We also have highest rates of divorce. Society is not what it used to be. So, in some ways, most of our, big bets in longevity in terms of making people more immune to inflammation, making people more immune to other effects of aging where the body can't get rid of trash, the trash accumulates. A lot of the diseases, when we break it down, cancer, Parkinson's, all of that, is essentially comes down to a few basic things. And if we can basically make human body immune or slow aging, but one of the things we also have to remember is part of the things that accelerate aging is mental factors. That's one of the reasons why we're also excited to back a lot of mental health companies, because if we did all the physical stuff, and even if all of the stuff worked, but we were stressed out of our minds, that is the number one factor that affects aging. You can take 2 people You stress one out and put them in the most stressful situation, their hair starts turning white, whatever. So even though we could fix the physical stuff, without fixing the mental stuff, I don't know if we're going to get to the right equilibrium.
Right, yeah, and that kind of brings up the question of like, what is a longevity company anyway, right? Because I think some people wouldn't necessarily think of a mental health company in the longevity space. Then there's this question of, you mentioned tackling aging versus right now, I feel like we're still in this model of tackling the diseases of aging, right? And so do you think, there's all these questions that surround that in terms of like, will the FDA ever consider aging a disease? Are we ever going to get there? And does it even matter? Should they be separated like that? Like the diseases of aging versus aging, or are they sort of all in the same bucket? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is a question which is often discussed within the aging community and is sort of slowly starting to seep out into the regulatory area. To be fair, it's people like Nir Barzilai and his colleagues who have pushed the idea of using a very well-tolerated compound like metformin as a multi-syndrome agent, which can address many aspects of aging simultaneously. That argument has been had with the FDA, and they appear to be quite receptive to it. It does open up a whole bag of worms about how you measure all the different impacts, and it does fly in the face of sort of conventional pharma thinking in the sense that you want a drug to be very specific to one tissue, one target, and you don't want it to affect other things. And in fact, if you were able to reduce heart disease as well as Alzheimer's disease simultaneously, that might kill your drug pipeline, which is kind of crazy from the perspective of an ever-expanding aging population with the incidence of all of these things going up. So it is going to require a sea change in terms of both the regulatory bodies as well as the researchers to begin to think about aging as the single biggest risk factor for all disease. And there's no question it is. You can point to a handful of exceptions, infectious disease, childhood diseases, but the vast majority of sort of billable disease is aging related. And so when you begin to treat that as a problem, then maybe the pipelines will open in terms of investment in new companies and so on and so on.
Right.
Oh, I was just going to say that the challenge from a company perspective is that, right now we can't measure aging very well, and the ways that have been proposed would require really massive clinical trials. And, you really want to spend, $40 million on your phase 2 when you don't have to. And that's one reason pharma likes sort of well-defined endpoints and targets. And this is very much top of mind for me right now as well, because we have our first drug, which if everything goes well, could be in people in a couple of years. And I wish aging were an indication, but it would have to be one where, in a small number of people in a short period of time, you could see an effect. And I don't think we're there yet, so we're definitely going to go the disease route.
Do you think that model will ever break down, the way that it is now? Because I feel like at some point it's going to break. But the question is when and what's going to break it. Any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that is not working well right now is that we're basically spending most of our money when it gets really acute, because let's say that, and again, like we have amazing minds in the audience and they can chime in. Like Parkinson's, cancer, like it doesn't happen overnight. Maybe it happens in 20 years. But then in the last year or last 2 years, it accelerates, and that's when all the physical symptoms start manifesting itself. So the problem, though, is that that's when people are most urgently caring about cure. So we're always spending all our efforts on the last mile in this case. And I'm kind of thinking of longevity as almost like a vaccination. What if like BioAge worked and a bunch of the companies in the audience worked, all of a sudden you're if you use this, all of a sudden you're going to be instead of having 80% of chance of having cancer, you're going to have 8% chance or 2% of chance of having cancer. And I think if we can get to that point where we can quantify that impact, I think everybody, including the payers, the health systems, the governments, will have to care about it, because then they're going to have a simple math calculation say, oh my God, if we don't do this, we're going to spend 20x the money, and that is money, by the way, nobody has. And so I think if we can re-educate people, and that's why I often feel that longevity is very misunderstood. And if it could be re-understood in a way where that is the real impact, that is the reason why it's so important for the ecosystem to work, for these companies to succeed, I think it's going to change people's approach.
This is somewhat in jest, but I think it might be partially kind of a naming thing. Like, arthritis means like inflammation of the joints, right? But like, if you were to say that out loud, I think the idea of longevity or aging sounds too general. And if you were to say something like aging-itis, or just like basically make it a like properly named disease, that would almost allow for kind of a more broad, because if you look at a lot of the diseases that we treat today, they're not well characterized. In fact, a lot of them are, I'd say, far less characterized than aging. They're hard to pin down, organ specific. We don't know what causes them. They're like IPF, right? Like idiopathic, we don't know what causes it. It's in the disease name. And so I think there's a question of like, what if we were to just make up a new disease name for aging and sort of just, use that. Nobody would know what it meant, but then we could go along with that.
Okay, good. We can take that away tonight and start thinking about what the new name's going to be.
I was forgetting too, but Restore Bio, they are sort of creatively going after aging, because they're looking at the number of respiratory infections as sort of a measure of immunosenescence, like in their clinical trial. So they're getting something that is short term, but is still sort of pointing at more general aging mechanisms, which I think is really interesting.
Right. So I think we want to open it up now to questions from the audience, if any of you are sitting here with a burning question. Oh, Reg.
Well, I did found diagnostic companies. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think it's just kind of the brutal reality of investing that some companies get higher multiple for exactly the same kind of business performance. So like right now, the credit is all in therapeutics, and it's mostly cancer and neuro. Because all the other diseases, but those two areas, because brain is still not well understood, it's like longevity, cancer, despite all this amazing amount of money, and even though we have made progress, it is not completely eradicated. Look, I think one of the things that we've seen, if you wait until this stuff is figured out, it's almost too late. So like the investing wisdom is, you cannot just be right, and then there are 100 other investors that are also right. That is not interesting. You have to split it 100 ways, but you have to be right and you have to be the sole person, which means that sometimes even though everybody in the room is looking at you and you're the fool for doing that, 10 years later, oh no, you were not the fool, we misunderstood and you understood. And you cannot wait 10 years to see what was right. So the way that we think about it is, hey, you know what? Like, it could be 10 approaches, 5 approaches, 3 approaches that are going to work. But the way we think about it is, the longevity is interesting because it's not like diagnostics, it's therapeutic. Because if we can give people the resiliency and resistance to not get sick, to not get cancer, to not get Parkinson's, right now, like, everybody in this room is anonymous, but if I said, how many people have a mother or father that has Parkinson's, all of a sudden, I know that 20 people in the room will, at some point in their lives, will care a lot about that just one thing and will almost do everything. Sell houses, even sell an organ if they have to not get that. So I know that that's going to be really valuable, versus diagnostic is just the area to say, you know what, we have 80% probability to tell you that you might get sick. It is valuable, but it is not as valuable as, hey, we can cure you or we can prevent you from getting sick.
More questions? I have one more question, actually. So, I spend time looking at the longevity space, and I wonder if, it feels like to me, a lot of people criticize, who aren't involved in the longevity space, criticize longevity companies because they think it's for wealthy people. Do you see the longevity space as sort of a luxury market, kind of like how Tesla aimed its cars at sort of wealthy people? Are longevity companies doing that? You're on the ground, or is it not like that at all? And basically everybody gets sick, and what's your take on that?
I mean, I think this is kind of like, to some extent, an old argument about medical breakthroughs. I mean, at each point in human sort of medical interventional history, if you like, there has been this argument: should we be interfering in the natural course of things? Should we be developing a vaccine? Should we be developing therapy for heart transplant? I mean, if you read the history of heart transplants and cardiac therapy in general, it's an interesting repetition of this argument. In the 50s, you had the development of the heart-lung machine. We shouldn't be doing this. This is not correct. Now, I mean, the original heart-lung machine was like roughly half the size of this room, and now they're the size of a small fridge. And they're very common. They're in use something like 3,000 times a day throughout the world. So it's an old argument, and it's kind of interesting that we keep having the same argument about medical intervention and human health and happiness. Because after all, I mean, touch on a point, everyone in this room is a target for successful therapeutics for aging, as well as everyone outside this room. So it's a kind of a nonsensical point in many ways, I think.
Yeah, I agree. But I was just curious what you had to think about that. Laura, you look like you want to say something.
So economically, it doesn't make any sense. Like if there were like 10 people willing to spend $1 billion each for this amazing therapy, the economies of scale that you'd get from like large scale manufacturing would mean that like that would be less profitable than marketing to like even just all the US, right? So like literally economically is hard to make that argument credible. Like if you believe that aging is like a shared phenomenon among most humans.
Right.
Maybe one last point I will make is I would break it down and say, look, there are two components, which is what is the minimum cost at which you can produce a viable cure or vaccine, and then how much actually can you charge for it? Right? There are a lot of medicines like, again, I think having worked at Roche, the first shock for me was anything that we use for antacid or like Tylenol or Advil, all of a sudden I'm in finance, I'm looking at the cost, I'm like, that's 0.001 cent. So why are we paying like, I don't know, $2 a pill for this bottle? It's all like the packaging and the TV ads that are going into it. So I think the interesting thing, like the previous thing we discussed about why now, so like for instance, like BioAge, like you don't have to have 1,000 scientists and go look at 10,000 different mushrooms to identify the compound. In fact, you can pretty much go to every data bank in the world with only 10 people, put it like, have computers do all the work. They're gonna look and like essentially find out every aspect of what makes those people different. You just could not do that 10 years ago, and then that's gonna drastically change the cost factor. Now, if you do find something, I don't know what it would take to produce and turn it into medicine. I think that is well understood already. The tough thing is to find out what that actually is. And also the way that the science is like, you know, going and accelerating, like now we have organoids. So like before, like the problem was testing on humans, you're sick, but we can't test it on you. What if it doesn't work? And actually you did have a chance to live and now like we killed you. Instead, we're like, well, why don't we take like a couple cells from you and create a replica organ or create part of you like in miniature form, and now we're gonna know for sure if it's gonna work on you or not. And I think that's the exciting part why this is golden age. None of these things were possible like 10 years ago. So not only is the chances of finding something much higher, but being able to produce it in mass scale at a point that is accessible to population is also higher. And I'm assuming and hoping that the governments will have a huge incentive to make it available, because otherwise people are gonna keep aging and they're gonna have to spend a huge fortune to try to fix them when they're most. I think where this is going to be most interesting is the reason why I mentioned brain and mental health. In terms of physical health, I think we have pretty well documented baseline in terms of what physical fitness means for people in the room. Like either you can lift a weight or you don't. You can run 1 mile or you don't. You can run 1 mile in 5 minutes versus 20 minutes. So it's pretty well documented that you can say with objectivity, you're like a champion athlete, you're like an absolute couch potato. But when it comes to things like brain function and other things, it's not measured. So like this is to your point, how difficult it is. If you were to slow aging, how do you even quantify the impact? So I think like the thing that I'm fascinated with, and this is the reason why mental health and brain science is so interesting, because like some of the companies we looked at, like they now have like the ability to give you 12 micro apps, and based on your memory function, reaction speed, and other stuff, they can identify from 10 years before, in addition to genetic factors, if you're gonna have like mental decay. To be honest with you, more than physical stuff, the biggest thing that scares me is to become a vegetable, because the only thing that separates us from other. So I think that's the thing. Like we were investors in Fitbit, and it's not like Fitbit came out with a crazy like scientific innovation, but all they did is if you wear this thing, you're never thinking about it, but think about 10,000 steps as the basic form of fitness. But we haven't established it. We haven't said mental fitness is X. We haven't said like brain acuity is X. So when somebody is at 40, but they have the sharpness of a 20-year-old, we're like, okay, that's what we're trying to replicate. It is not well understood or identified. So as a result, you're like, I don't understand, so I don't get it. But the moment it becomes understandable and measurable, then I think like there is potential for the first category to be very interesting.
And I think I would say that it's most likely to recapitulate what happens with exercise, in the sense that you can take an individual who's not physically optimized, you can exercise them, and then you can get these dramatic improvements in function across multiple domains. That type of approach for evaluating function in a general sense is pretty well understood within the exercise community. And I'm not just talking about running a track or lifting weights. it's across multiple domains. So therapeutics which genuinely reverse or enhance your function across multiple domains of aging will be measurable, and you will see that. And I think that will be quite dramatic, and it'll happen relatively quickly.
I'm expecting a lot of these interventions to impact frailty, like frailty itself. Like certainly we've seen that with, a month of parabiosis in mice can have dramatic consequences. 3 months of rapamycin treatment can improve sort of several aspects of frailty. And that's something that maybe we're not tracking now in the context of specific particular diseases, but that we can in the future and give us a number to track that we can move the needle on with these therapies.
Maybe one last angle to add is people's vanity. So for instance, like, again, I'm just thinking, like, I think frailty is a really good indication. We might not think of, like, cancer and these terrible diseases until it hits us, but when it comes to our vanity, we really care about it. So when you tell people, hey, like, you're gonna be strong and, vibrant, and that might have a bigger impact, or like, I don't know how you guys think about aging, but like, men, like, losing their hair, like, it's a big vanity thing. So like we kind of like also think about like, I don't know if you would necessarily categorize it as a aging company, but by extension, like it is a form of aging. So if you slowed and you said, well, like now you're like not gonna lose your hair or like whatever, other things that happen, and maybe like we take a few of these things that people care more, and that's why I like use the brain function, because I don't think anybody like wants to be less sharp or, like forget things, whatever. So like the ones where people have a more acute reaction, like, oh my God, like I want to be smart. I don't want to lose my smartness. I don't want to lose my memory. I don't want to lose some of the things that I care most about. If hopefully we can use those things to impact the wider areas of things people care about. And this partially comes to like one of the things that we talk about investing is, it's not just enough to be a good scientist. You have to be a great storyteller. If we don't do a good job of telling a great story, that I know that a lot of people in this panel like have done an amazing job, that's kind of the thing. Get the word out and like make people relate to it. And I don't know if there's anybody from press, like one of the things that frustrates me is there's like, I don't know, like 1,000 articles about the budget shutdown, whatever. I'm like, God, like, do we really need to read 1,000 first article on it? But there is like no articles written about the amazing scientific breakthroughs. And that affects everyone. So like we need to kind of make it sexy and interesting and exciting to have more people care about, so they don't only care about it at the very last stage when it hits them, and it hits them the hardest.
I know there's more questions. A quick follow-up on that, though. Are there more scientists in the aging community who want to be entrepreneurs? Because also, to tell a good story, that's an entrepreneur's job. I mean, do you see more of that?
Well, I think Laura and Sorry, they can both speak to this more directly, but certainly as an academic, there's so many examples of people forming spin-off companies. Looking in this room, I know several people who are sort of emigres from academia and have formed their own companies. There's also people with two hats like myself, more than one in the audience I see. So it's more and more common, and I think the impetus for doing it is because you can do so much more so fast in the private sector than you can, with a traditional sort of academic route.
So true. Okay, I saw some hands up.
Ooh, I love this question. So this speaks to, I think, one of the sort of the hidden areas of aging research, which we don't talk enough about, and that is that most of the interventions we've developed so far to date, and which we're broadly excited about and bringing to the general population in terms of drug development, are doing exactly what you suggest. They're addressing average lifespan. They're improving the health span of individuals. Now, that's not a terrible thing. You have basically 2/3 of the American public is overweight. If you can improve their health span, you're going to have an enormous impact on health. But are you really tackling the underlying biology of aging when you do that? And this is one of the things which we talk about in Gero State, is the idea that truly novel interventions which address the underlying biology of aging, I'm not sure I can point to a single example which is really shifting the needle. Really shifting the needle would be making a worm live 2 years instead of 3 weeks, making a mouse live 10 years instead of 2 years. We can't do that. We can move in the physiological range of optimizing health span and lifespan akin to what happens when you put a person on a regular exercise regimen and a good diet. You're moving the needle by 10, 20, 30% maybe, but you're not doing it like 5-fold, 10-fold, 100-fold. So it really comes back to your core question. Are we really addressing the fundamental biology of aging in these therapeutic approaches, which we have, or are we really just sort of shifting the average lifespan a little bit? It's a question I'd really like to see answered.
I think actually, so one thing is, I think that we in the past year we've gotten probably 50 plus investors coming to us and saying, tell us about the aging field and all the different things in it. And they'll have read like the hallmarks of aging. And I think the kind of weird thing is, I think that all the best opportunities will come from like outside the field. I think none of the stuff that we're talking about on like kind of the normal aging track is actually the most interesting stuff. Like there's these weird studies like FGF21, right? I mean, that's a canonical example, but like that came from a diabetes trial where you're trying to overexpress a protein to make sure it's safe and kind of like a lifespan study, and then it increases lifespan by like 20%. Where did that come from? Like we never found that in any kind of aging study before. And so like, there is a canonical kind of track, but I honestly think the best things will come from people just saying, oh, that's weird, in totally different areas of biology. And so more people looking outside the common track is actually, I think, probably like would be a helpful thing.
And what about in other areas too? Like, I don't know, other engineering areas or AI, or do you think that maybe some breakthroughs will come through those sort of fields as well?
Well, yeah, just related to that, I guess, I still feel that aging is a young field, right? So like we've mapped out some core pathways of aging, but probably not everything, probably not even the most important ones. And I think that yes, that basically less biased ways of measuring everything that's going on in an aging animal is going to discover a lot of new pathways.
Yeah, and coming back to some of the technological breakthroughs, to quote Tenacious D, we have the technology. So we really do have the technology now to make dramatic breakthroughs in this sort of core aspect of fundamentally identifying new pathways and not just making a slightly better rapamycin, a slightly better metformin. We really want to dramatically revise that kind of landscape in terms of interventions. And I think we're on the cusp. We really are on the cusp. But my perspective is I think expertise is still pretty thin on the ground. There's a lack of general knowledge about this whole space. You certainly don't want to discourage people from entering it who have no experience in the area whatsoever, because you often get good ideas and cross-fertilization from that type of approach. But on the other hand, there's comparatively little emphasis in training programs across the country on geroscience in general. It's still a niche kind of area, and you don't want people to be rediscovering that particular wheel didn't work when people have looked at it and tested it 10, 15 years ago, and there's no merit to that area just because they're not aware of this. So my perspective is I think we need more investment in training programs to bring up crops of young scientists who will help cross-fertilize and grow new ideas and new approaches.
One thing, and I think before the panel started, somebody mentioned this, but I think the biggest bottleneck is nothing like, even though we would like to say that like imagination is really important, nothing sparks the imagination as the first success story. So until we get the first major IPO, the first major breakthrough, like we talked about a lot of things that are at the cusp of breaking out or getting close to breaking out, but nothing has broken out where like it has become the poster child or the poster innovation. So I think like we can like mention all of those things. Like, should we have more funding? Absolutely yes. Should we have more press attention? Absolutely yes. Should we have more scientists? Absolutely yes. And especially from new fields. Laura is absolutely right. Like one of the things that I've seen being very early at Google, Larry and Sergey like said, you know what? Like we're not going to hire traditional people. We're just going to hire a bunch of smart people and give them problems that they didn't even think about. And you know what? It is true. Like a lot of great innovation, like some of the best innovation in finance came from physics. Right? Because the people that are experts are so enamored in that field that they stop thinking out of box and like they spend 20 years, like they can't think of like new ideas, and somebody who's never thought about it is like, well, why didn't you do that? You're like, oh my God, I've been working on this for 20 years. Like, yeah, like why didn't we think about that? So hopefully like that poster children, hopefully some of the founders here in the audience, like if these things succeed, and that's one of the things that I'm excited about, because it's kind of like take a lot of collaboration and ecosystem to make this journey accelerate and like be exciting. And hopefully everybody in the room can be part of that.
I think that's a really good note to end on, actually. We need an aging unicorn. Okay, well, please stay and enjoy us for cocktails and more conversation. Thanks.